इस सत्र में उत्तर पूर्व और उत्तरी क्षेत्र के लेखक अपनी रचनाओं का पाठ करेंगे। इस सत्र के उद्घाटन के लिए हमने प्रख्यात अंग्रेजी कवि रॉबिन को आमंत्रित किया है। साहित्य अकादमी की ओर से आपका बहुत बहुत अभिनंदन कि आपने हमारा निमंत्रण स्वीकार किया। मैं अकादमी के सचिव डॉक्टर के श्रीनिवास राव जी को निवेदन करता हूं कि कृपया रॉबिन जी को मंच पर लाएं। अकादमी ने पुष्पगुच्छ देने की जगह पर अब पुस्तकें भेंट करने की परंपरा शुरू की है। मैं सचिव महोदय से निवेदन करूंगा कि वे पुस्तक रॉबिन जी को पुस्तकें भेंट स्वरूप प्रदान करके स्वागत कर रहे हैं और औपचारिक स्वागत के लिए आदरणीय डॉक्टर के श्रीनिवास राव।
Namaskar and good morning to all of you. Dear Dr. Rabindra, Sri Kolsaikia ji, Bihari Singh ji, Sylvanus Lamare ji, honorable friends of Sahitya Academy, and also our Dogri Advisory Board's convener, Dr. Lalit Mohammad Raji, and writers from Northeast and Northern. I am very glad to welcome all of you for this edition of Northeast and Northern Writers Meet, that is Purvottari, which is a part of Festival of Letters 2017, which we started since 2014 as a part of our festival. Friends, holding this meet is indeed acknowledging, appreciating and encouraging literary talent of the young Indian writers and also the established writers, having them acquainted with other regional literary cultures of India. From the literature of the young, the readership certainly gets to know as to how young generation are evolving their independent worldviews and how they are dealing with the literary traditions of the elder writers of the other regions and the influences as how they are exploring into their societies and cultures. Friends, we all know that the literature of Northeastern India has its own voices and has affluent traditions. Their literary classics need to be translated in other regional languages. At present, the social environment of the Northeast is of insecure and the people there are suffering hardships for their survival. Their literature obviously reflects these situations, but surprisingly, this literature is not at all restricted to expression of insecurity, violence and suffering. It proudly talks about nature, human relationships, creative inspiration, peace, fraternity and many other so very positive aspects of human life. Their mighty literary traditions, including oral ones, certainly have offered them strength and great inspiration. Sahitya Academy heartily welcomes vibrant and original literature of the Northeast and acquaints it to the rest of Indian readership. The Academy holds literary events such as Northeast and Western Writers Meet, Northeast and Southern Writers Meet, and so on at regular intervals and attempts to offer its national platform for the Northeastern writers of different generations. This national cultural exchange, I am sure all of you will find significant for encouraging Indian readership and other literary activities. Friends, I take this opportunity in welcoming Dr. Rabindra, a bilingual poet and translator who writes in English and Manipuri, who has kindly agreed to deliver the inaugural address. And he has 3 published books of poetry to his credit, and his poems have appeared in a number of prestigious anthologies and literary journals, magazines. And he poeted Dancing Earth, an anthology of poetry from Northeast, and is the recipient of Uday Bharati National Award for Poetry and the Katha Translation Prize, and presently is teaching literature at the Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. Welcome to Dr. Rabindra. With these few words, once again I welcome the distinguished guest and also Rabindra. And because it is a very informal kind of inaugural session, actually we thought of having only inaugural address, nothing else in the inaugural, no formalities. So I thought we will have a plenty of time to address this August gathering, and thereafter we have the reading sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Good morning, friends. I hope you can hear me. I'm grateful to the Sahitya Academy for giving me the honor of delivering the inaugural address of Purvottari, a gathering of writers from the Northeast and the North. I must confess at the outset that I have read only a little of the poetry from the North, a bit of Hindi, Urdu, Kashmiri poetry in translation. So I would rather talk about the poetry of the Northeast in this inaugural address. Dr. Rao mentioned the title of the anthology which a friend and I edited. It was published by Penguin. It's titled Dancing Earth. And I would like to share with you a part of the introduction that I wrote for this, that this friend and I wrote for this anthology. Any introduction to the poetry of the Northeast must inevitably address two important questions relating to what constitutes the Northeast or its poetry. The Northeast is, of course, a blanket term that glosses over, the heterogeneity of the region, and it is not the homogeneous province it is made out to be by many. With a very slender, historical and geographical link to the rest of India, the Northeast remains little known and perhaps largely misunderstood. Singled out, for example, as India's insurgent heartland. So it's 8 states of Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim and Tripura are inhabited by such a conglomeration of peoples. A melange of cultures, languages, and religions, that it would be an injustice to make any generalized, statement about them. So while Assam and Tripura may be said to be dominated by Assamese and the Bengalis belonging to the broad Indo-Aryan group, and the rest of the states by some distinct tribes, the real picture is much more complicated. Manipur alone is home to more than 20 ethnic groups in its list of scheduled tribes, with all of them breaking up into a complex network of sub-tribes and clans speaking their own languages and dialects. So the same would be more or less true of all the other states. And yet, despite this confusion of tribes and sub-tribes, cultures and languages, the literatures of the region are not as tangled as may be imagined, and some broad statements, could still be made about them. So apart from the Assamese, the Manipuris and the Bengalis of Tripura, who have their own distinct scripts and whose written literatures could be traced back to the 15th century or even earlier, the literary history of most of the other communities is fairly new. Perhaps as recent as the advent of the white missionaries, from Wales and America in the middle of the 19th century. In the Khasi Hills in about 1841, Thomas Jones of the Welsh Calvinistic Methodist Mission cast the Khasi language in written form using the Roman script. As a writer remarked, the success of the Welshman's script led eventually to the adoption of Roman rather than the Bengali script, by the neighboring Garo, Mizo and Naga peoples. And later by almost all the tribes except, for the Boroks and the Chakmas of Tripura, who also use the Bengali script, and some in Assam who use the Assamese script. Okay, so given this background, it was only natural that the majority of the tribes would take to the same kind of literature and influence, which were exclusively Christian and English, in contrast to the Assamese, Manipuri and Bengali, who were exposed to Sanskrit and Hindi literature as well. So the literary legacy of the white missionaries can be said to be double-edged. While on the one hand, they gifted the tribes with a common literary heritage, on the other, they made them deny the existence of their own literatures in the rich oral traditions, and taught them to be ashamed of whatever is theirs as something pagan and preposterous. That is why the poetry of some of the hill tribes even today is seen to be either singing hymns or adoring cuckoos in the woods and non-existent daffodils in the vales. Another critic has also pronounced that the literature of the states apart from Assam is largely based on the folklore narrative tradition. But this Victorian characteristic, this Victorian windiness referred to above, which offers at best a chocolate box view of the tribal past, and has virtually nothing to say about the agonizing dilemmas of the present, or the presumption that much of the poetry of the Northeast written by the tribes, in the languages of the tribes, is caught in some kind of a folk time warp, is definitely not the contemporary poetry of the Northeast. So modern poetry in the region could be found in the free verse of Bengali, Assamese, Manipuri, and those tribal poets of the different states who write in their native languages and in English. So these writers, with their extensive reading of modern world literature from English translations, of course, also passionately grapple with some of the psychological and social perplexities of contemporary life, of present day life. So they, having cut their teeth on, on the works of poets from other parts of the world, not just British and American literature, but poetry from third world countries and European poetry, indeed, the rest of the world, the hard-edged modernists of the third world. So these poets find common ground in chronicling their subjective realities and the predicament of their people. So, some critics also believe that the uniqueness of Northeast poetry is the consequence of contemporary events. The writer from the Northeast differs from his counterpart in the mainland in a very significant way. Dr. Rao just mentioned, the agonizing political situation in the Northeast, and how the writers from the Northeast have been influenced by that situation. He differs. The writer he or she, from the Northeast differs from his counterpart in the mainland in a significant way. Living with the menace of the gun, the threat of the gun, he cannot indulge merely in any kind of a verbal kind of magic, and any abstract aesthetics. But he or she must perforce master what some of us call the art of witness. But perhaps this individuality could be better explained by briefly stating what constitutes Northeast poetry. So generally speaking, there are certain features commonly to be found in Northeast poetry today. There is, for instance, a strong rootedness visible everywhere in the writings of the Northeast poets. The roots, as in origins, of the beloved land, the roots of the people's culture, the roots of the times, and most of all, the roots of the past have sunken deep into their poetry. So the poetry of the Northeast, is therefore rooted, as against the alienated stance of modernist city poets. It is autobiographical, sometimes as against impersonal poetry, which we're all familiar with, which is detached impersonal poetry that you find in modernist poetry, especially poetry written by the metropolitan poets. So, if the modernist urban poets are culturally uprooted, deracinated, the Northeast, culturally uprooted cosmopolitans, who are cast adrift in a sea of exotic arts and cultures. The Northeast poet is still rooted. For example, in my friend, the Khasi poet Kanfam Singh Nonkanri's poems, it becomes evident that the Khasi Hills and its people define his roots and give him an identity. So these poets are bound together by their great love for the land and everything that it signifies, and this could be seen in the overwhelming presence of nature, in many of their poems, you know. So it is the native world, most of all, which comes into view in the work of these poets. A predilection of images and for images and motifs drawn from nature is proof that Northeast poetry is deeply rooted in the land. So when I mention the word nature, nature is not an impassive witness to the existential despair of men and women as in the contemporary wasteland of modernist poets, but nature is a living presence for the Northeast poets, where hills and rivers are also gods and goddesses. Hills and rivers are also deities. Everything has life: rocks, stones, trees, rivers, hills, and all life is sacred, says Mamandai, one of our renowned writers from the Northeast. So the fates of the natives are inevitably intertwined, with these aspects of nature. So, in spite of the trappings of modernity, the life of most of the communities of the Northeast is also defined by their folk origins. So this is another aspect of Northeast poetry. It's again a proof of the rootedness of Northeast poetry, as I mentioned, is in the recurrent appearance of myth and tribal folklore, which is the hard subject matter of these poets. So this is something very interesting. When I mentioned the folk world or the mythic world, what you'd be surprised to know is that the mythic world or the folk world still survives at the frontiers of the civilized world, and the folk world still continues to assume the intensity of reality for many of the communities of the Northeast. It is their world. When you talk about the folk and the mythic world, it is not something which happened in the past, which happened long time ago. It is something ongoing. It still exists. The mythic world still exists. For many of the communities of the Northeast, for many of the writers of the Northeast. When you talk myths and folk, the folk, they provide a key to the cultural behavior of a people. But interestingly, when communities seem to be losing their way in the midst of cultural colonization, these mythopoeic poets, out of a deep-seated desire, step in and try to emulate the traditional storytellers and shamans by recalling the stories of the tribe, by recalling the lore of the tribe. So poets like Desmond Karmoflang or Mamandai, would try to emulate the storytellers of their own tribes. And again, in my friend, aspects of confusing non-English poetry, again, interestingly, we have this, spontaneous, thing or gift, for wit and humor. It's perhaps a quality that he inherited from the Pawar tradition of the Khasis. Pawar is essentially, I think, Professor would agree with me that it's essentially performance poetry, which comprises limericks, epigrammatic lines, riddles, nonsense verse, witty exchanges. Kanfam Singh Nonkanri has made use of this tradition of the Khasis, which also points to the folk world. Again, a very interesting concept of ethno-poetics, which is a non-Western, non-Anglo-Saxon, non-Western, de-centered poetics, of the indigenous people of the Northeast, can be found. The chronicling of contemporary events, the fallout of violence, above all, is also another important aspect of Northeast poetry. I mentioned, the poetry of witness, which also lends a sense of immediacy and vividness, to the poetry, practiced by these poets. What I'm trying to say is that there is often this charge that some of the Northeast poets are unduly obsessed with the poetry of politics and brutality. A few fine poets have moved beyond merely recording events, and they seem to have internalized the complex conflict between themselves and the milieu. So in Manipur, for example, when the reality becomes oppressive, when things are too difficult to bear, to tolerate anymore, when the reality becomes oppressive, a few excellent poets, they seek refuge in absurdist irony, often directed towards oneself. They seek refuge in parody. They seek refuge in satire, and they also reveal an inclination towards the surreal. So it is a rejection by these poets of the harrowing realism of the times. And as I mentioned, they in turn also reveal an inclination towards the surreal. I'll just give you an example. In Manipuri, in the Manipuri poet Ibomcha's poem, Story of a Dream, murderous bullets turn into luscious fruits. Bullets turn into fruits. And in the Ibomcha's poem titled I Want to Be Killed by an Indian Bullet, terrorists visit his home in the guise of the 5 elements. So, to be a very tenacious witness to the agonizing and recurrent political violence without sensationalizing it is also a risk that the Northeast poet has to undertake often. So, this is not a poetry of unquestioning nationalism. In the face of a fear of a loss of identity, and encroachment of territory and cultural values. But as I mentioned, it is a nervous internalization of the increasingly complex poetics of the region. So, I just like to mention that it would be a mistake to typecast the poets on the basis of these broad themes alone. I would like to mention another aspect of Northeast poetry before I wind up. The theme of displacement. Displacement, which the young poets who mostly write in English, poets such as Navanita Kanungo, Anurag Rudra, Goirik Brahmachari, and others write about. Displacement